The worst mistake I ever made was letting my driver open the door for me that night. Not because I wasn't used to it, after all, he'd been doing it for months, a quiet, unassuming presence who moved with that effortless confidence that only men his age seem to have, as if they had all the time in the world to figure out who they were and what they wanted, unlike me, who had spent years meticulously building a life of control, order, and precision, only to find that one moment, one insignificant, inconsequential moment, could unravel it all like a loose thread being pulled too hard. I should have just gotten in the car like I always did. I should have kept my gaze fixed forward, should have scrolled through my emails, should have made a call, should have done anything but glance up, anything but let my eyes linger on the way the city lights caught on the edge of his jawline, the faintest sheen of sweat glistening at his temple from the humid night air, the slow, absent motion of his fingers adjusting the cuff of his shirt, rolling it just slightly past his wrist, revealing the sharp definition of veins and tendons beneath his skin, and for reasons I couldn't quite explain, I found myself gripping the edge of the car door a little tighter, my breath catching for just a fraction of a second too long before I forced myself to look away. But the moment had already happened. And by the time I settled into the back seat, feeling the smooth leather beneath my palms as I exhaled, I knew, somewhere, somehow, something had shifted. Ethan was 24 years old, quiet, reliable, impossibly composed for his age, and as far as I had ever been able to tell, perfectly, unapologetically straight, the kind of man who probably had a girlfriend who rolled her eyes at the fact that he still held doors open, who probably spent his weekends fixing something with his hands, who probably never spent a single second of his life thinking about the things I was suddenly, inconveniently, thinking about. I should have let the moment pass. But the problem with noticing something for the first time is that you can't notice it. And the real problem? I was almost certain he had noticed, too. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white as we moved through the streets, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement blending into the quiet static of my thoughts. But no matter how much I tried to focus, no matter how many times I told myself to stop, my attention kept drifting forward, to the way Ethan's hands moved over the wheel, to the casual precision in the way he navigated the roads, to the way his fingers tapped lightly against the leather, a slow, absent rhythm. That somehow felt too deliberate, too aware, too knowing. I had spent my entire career perfecting the art of restraint, the ability to read a situation, assess every risk, calculate every possible outcome before making a single move, and yet here I was, sitting in the back of my own car, watching the way the faint glow of streetlights flickered against his skin, wondering how I had failed to notice before, how I had failed to notice him before. Ethan had always been composed, professional, perfectly indifferent to everything outside of his job, but lately, something was different. It was in the way his voice had started carrying a slight edge when he spoke, the way his gaze lingered just a little too long when he glanced in the rearview mirror, the way, on more than one occasion, I had caught the ghost of a smirk at the corner of his mouth, like he knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for something. "You always this quiet after a long day?" His voice broke the silence, smooth, even, but not entirely casual, not entirely innocent. I exhaled slowly, leaning back against the seat, keeping my expression neutral, composed, unreadable, or at least, I tried to. "Depends on the company," I murmured, watching the way his fingers flexed slightly against the wheel, the way his throat moved as he swallowed. A red light. A pause. A moment that stretched just a second too long. His grip on the gear shift tightened, his knuckles flexing, and then, he moved. Not far. Not much. But just enough that his arm brushed against the edge of my knee. Deliberate. Measured. A test. And instead of pulling away, I let it happen. It should have been nothing, just another late-night drive through the city, just another ride home where I sat in the backseat pretending that the quiet between us was comfortable, pretending that I wasn't aware of every small detail, the way his hands flexed over the wheel with a control that felt almost excessive, the way his breathing had become slower, more deliberate, the way his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror at intervals that had nothing to do with checking the traffic behind us and, "Hey! Thanks for watching up to this point. If you're enjoying the story, drop a comment below. We read every single one, and it really helps the channel. And hey, thanks a lot. Everything to do with watching me, like he was waiting, like he was testing, like he was daring me to make a move I shouldn't even be considering. And yet, when the next red light bathed the inside of the car in a dim glow, when the rain intensified against the windshield, when the sound of the engine idling became the only thing anchoring me to the moment, I felt the inevitability of it settle deep in my chest, that slow, creeping realization that we had already crossed some invisible threshold, that whatever restraint had been holding this in place was hanging by a thread so thin, so fragile, that all it would take was the smallest shift to snap it entirely. He exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, his fingers adjusting against the gear shift, and I should have ignored the way the movement caught my attention, should have looked away, should have done anything but focus on the way his knuckles tensed, the way his veins stood out just slightly beneath his skin, the way he sat perfectly still except for that one subtle motion of his hands, waiting, as if he knew I was watching, as if he knew that something inside me was already unraveling. I shifted, barely, just enough for my knee to brush against the center console, just enough to feel the warmth of his body radiating through the space between us, and when he inhaled, when his grip on the wheel flexed for a fraction of a second before settling again, I knew he wasn't unaffected. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice smooth, steady, but carrying something beneath it that wasn't quite as composed as he wanted it to be, something measured, something that felt almost like a challenge, and when I exhaled, when I let the silence stretch just a little too long before responding, I saw the way his fingers curled slightly against the wheel, as if he were waiting for confirmation, as if he were waiting for me to admit something neither of us had spoken out loud yet. "Long day," I murmured, my voice coming out quieter than I intended, rougher than I expected, but still controlled, still careful, still pretending that I wasn't paying attention to every breath he took, every small movement he made, every single shift in the atmosphere around us. He let out a soft chuckle, the kind that wasn't really amusement, more of a quiet acknowledgement, more of a reaction to the weight of what was happening between us rather than anything I had actually said, and then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, as if it wasn't deliberate at all, as if he wasn't watching for my reaction, he moved. It was small, insignificant to anyone who wasn't already tuned into every single detail the way I was, just a subtle shift of his arm as he adjusted his hand on the gear shift, but in that movement, in the slow, measured way his elbow just barely grazed my leg, in the way neither of us acknowledged it, in the way he didn't pull away immediately, in the way the contact lasted 1 second too long, the thread snapped, and suddenly, everything I had spent months trying to control, everything I had convinced myself was just in my head, everything that had been simmering just beneath the surface crashed through the carefully constructed barrier I had put between us. He didn't speak. Didn't move away. Didn't flinch. Just let it happen. And when the light turned green, when he finally exhaled and pushed the car forward, his fingers flexing over the wheel, his grip just a little too tight, I knew this wasn't a mistake, this wasn't an accident, this was a decision. A test. A question. A line drawn in the smallest way possible, but a line nonetheless, and I had every opportunity to step back over it, to pretend it hadn't been crossed, to pretend it hadn't happened at all. Instead, I leaned forward, just slightly, just enough that my fingertips ghosted over the back of his seat, just enough that I could see the sharp inhale he took, just enough that when his eyes flicked toward mine in the mirror, there was no doubt left, no hesitation, no confusion about what this was. "You keep doing that," he murmured, voice lower now, rougher, his fingers flexing against the wheel again, his grip tighter, more deliberate, and I might start thinking you actually want something from me. I should have laughed. Should have pulled away. Should have reminded myself that this was a boundary I wasn't supposed to cross, a situation that should have never reached this point, a risk that I wasn't the kind of man to take, but instead, I let the silence stretch between us again, let the weight of his words settle, let my fingers drift just slightly lower, just enough for the barest touch against the edge of his sleeve. He inhaled sharply. Not in surprise. Not in discomfort. But in something else entirely. And then, just as I was about to say something, just as I was about to break the silence, just as I was about to acknowledge what was happening between us in words rather than actions, he moved, not away, but closer. Not enough to be obvious. Not enough for anyone watching to notice. But enough that when he finally spoke, his voice barely above a murmur, the weight of it hit me harder than I was prepared for. "Still sure about that?" And then, just like that, just as my lips parted to respond, just as I realized that I was no longer in control of any of this, just as my fingertips curled slightly against the fabric of his sleeve, the car rolled to a stop in front of my building, the world outside still moving, still buzzing, still completely unaware of what had just happened inside this car, of how much had changed in the span of a single ride, of how much control I had already lost before I had even fully admitted to myself that I wanted to lose it. Ethan let out a slow exhale, his fingers flexing once more, his grip on the wheel tightening before he finally shifted the car into park, and for a second, just a second, he didn't move, didn't turn, didn't say anything, as if he was waiting, as if he was giving me one last chance to walk away, to pretend nothing had happened, to pretend that I wasn't already too far gone to turn back. I didn't move either. Didn't speak. Didn't pretend. And then, before I could stop myself, before I could think, before I could let reason talk me out of what was about to happen, before I could remind myself that this was reckless, dangerous, unwise, I reached forward again. And this time, he didn't just let it happen. This time, he met me halfway. The air inside the car was thicker than the humidity outside, the rain still drumming steadily against the windshield, the distant neon glow of the city filtering through the misted glass, casting hazy streaks of light that danced over Ethan's skin, over the sharp angles of his jaw, over the way his breathing had shifted, slower, heavier, controlled in a way that felt deliberate, in a way that told me he was just as aware of what had happened as I was, just as aware of how impossible it was to take it back, just as aware that we had crossed a line neither of us had any intention of stepping back over. His fingers still rested near the gear shift, still carried the weight of what had just happened, still held that same quiet tension that hadn't dissipated even after our hands had separated, even after my breath had steadied, even after I had told myself that I could sit here for a moment, compose myself, pretend that this was still something I could control. But it wasn't. Because I could still feel the way his knuckles had pressed against my leg when he shifted, could still feel the heat of his skin beneath the fabric of my sleeve when I reached forward, could still hear the way his breath had caught in his throat when he let me touch him, when he didn't stop me, when he met me halfway like he had been waiting for it just as long as I had. He exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the wheel in an absent rhythm, his expression unreadable, composed, except for the slight tension in his jaw, the slight tightness in his grip, the slight flicker of something in his gaze when he turned his head just enough to glance at me through the mirror, just enough to acknowledge that we were still here, still sitting in the aftermath of something we couldn't name yet, something that wasn't just a moment, something that had changed everything. "You gonna sit back there all night?" he murmured, his voice lower than usual, rougher, carrying the kind of weight that made my stomach tighten, that made my breath feel like it was sticking somewhere in my throat, that made me painfully aware of the fact that my heart was still beating just a little too fast. I could have laughed. Could have played it off, could have leaned back against the seat and acted as if I hadn't just thrown away every ounce of restraint I had spent months convincing myself I still had, but instead, I let the silence stretch between us for just a second too long, let the weight of his words settle, let my fingertips ghost over the leather beside me, still hyper-aware of the fact that minutes ago, they had been somewhere else entirely, on someone else entirely, gripping something entirely different. "You in a hurry to get rid of me?" I asked, voice quieter than I expected, measured in a way that wasn't natural, in a way that felt more like a defense mechanism than actual composure, because the reality was, I didn't know what the hell I was doing, didn't know what the hell this was, didn't know if I was supposed to step out of the car and pretend like my entire body wasn't still buzzing from the way he felt against me, from the way his fingers had moved just enough to let me know this wasn't one-sided, wasn't accidental, wasn't a mistake. His smirk was slow, lazy, like he was reading every thought that passed through my head before I even had the chance to process them myself, like he knew exactly what I was thinking, exactly what I wanted, exactly what I was still too stubborn to admit out loud, and when he exhaled again, when he let his shoulders roll back like he was shaking off the weight of something heavy, I realized he wasn't in a hurry at all. "Depends," he said, shifting slightly, his movement slow, measured, his fingers gripping the wheel just a little too tightly before relaxing again, and when he turned his head just enough for me to see the way his pupils had blown just slightly, just enough to confirm that this wasn't in my head, that he wasn't as unaffected as he wanted to pretend, I felt something low and sharp coil in my stomach, something that made my throat feel tight, something that made the space between us feel so much smaller than it actually was. "On what?" I asked, my voice steadier now, quieter, more controlled, even though I felt anything but controlled, even though my entire body was still too aware of the fact that this wasn't a fantasy anymore, wasn't an impossible thought, wasn't something I could shove into the back of my mind and ignore. "On whether or not you're getting out," he said, and the way he said it, low, even, with that same barely there smirk tugging at the corner of his lips, with that same heavy amusement in his gaze, with that same challenge laced beneath every syllable, was enough to make something in me snap all over again. I inhaled sharply, dragging my hand through my hair, letting the silence stretch again, letting the moment settle, letting myself come to terms with the fact that this wasn't over, that it wasn't going to be over, that it had already started, that I was already too deep inside of it to pretend otherwise. And then, before I could stop myself, before I could talk myself out of it, before I could pretend like I wasn't still sitting here for a reason, before I could rationalize my way out of something I had already lost control of, I did something worse than the first mistake, something worse than letting myself touch him, something worse than crossing the first line. I leaned forward. Not much. Not enough to close the distance between us entirely. But enough to make sure he knew. Enough to make sure there was no room left for misinterpretation. Enough to make sure that whatever happened next, it was his choice. And when Ethan exhaled, slow and deliberate, his fingers tapping against the console for half a second before he finally, turned toward me completely, when his gaze dropped, when his tongue flicked out just barely to wet his lips, when the smirk that had been playing at his mouth finally faded into something sharper, something darker, something heavier, I knew exactly what his choice was. And when he reached forward, when his fingers curled around my wrist, when the heat of his palm burned against my skin, when the space between us disappeared entirely, I stopped thinking, stopped hesitating, stopped wondering whether or not this was a mistake. Because it was. And I didn't care. The thing about crossing a line is that once you do it, once you step over that carefully drawn boundary, once you make a decision that can't be undone, there's no going back, no pretending that it never happened, no returning to the comfort of ignorance, no slipping back into the safety of pretending that you don't want something you've already taken. And as I sat in the back seat, my breathing still uneven, my pulse still hammering beneath my skin, the lingering heat of Ethan's fingers still burned into my wrist, I knew I had already made my choice, and so had he. The city outside kept moving, indifferent to what had just happened inside this car, the neon lights reflecting against the rain-slicked streets, the muffled hum of engines and distant voices blending into the steady rhythm of the night. But inside, within the cramped, dimly lit space, the world had shifted into something different, something tense, something weighted, something neither of us could ignore anymore. And when Ethan exhaled, when his grip on the wheel tightened for just a second, longer than necessary, I knew he felt it too. He hadn't spoken since it happened, since the moment his fingers had curled around my wrist, since the moment I had leaned forward just enough for the choice to be his, since the moment he had made it without hesitation, since the moment I had stopped thinking altogether, since the moment I had let him pull me in, let him break through the last thread of restraint I had been clinging to, let him erase the space between us entirely. And now, in the suffocating silence, in the aftermath of something that wasn't just physical but something else entirely, I was waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to react, waiting for him to be the one to pull away first, waiting for him to break the silence that I couldn't bring myself to break. The car slowed as we pulled onto the quieter streets near my building, the rain still coming down in soft, steady waves, the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows inside the car, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought maybe that was it, maybe it was over, maybe we had taken what we wanted and that would be the end of it, But then, just as the tires rolled to a stop against the curb, just as I reached for the door handle, just as I told myself to step out and leave, his voice cut through the silence, low, steady, but carrying something else beneath it, something dangerous, something that sent a slow burn curling through my chest before I even had time to process it. "You're not gonna pretend that didn't happen, are you?" I froze. My fingers stalled against the cool metal of the door handle, my breath catching just slightly, my chest tightening with something that felt too much like anticipation, too much like a challenge, too much like the kind of recklessness I had spent years avoiding. And when I turned my head, when I met his gaze through the mirror, I saw it, the same thing I was feeling, the same thing he was trying to keep controlled, the same thing neither of us had the strength to deny anymore. "You think I could?" I asked, and the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers tapped once against the wheel before stilling again, the way his tongue flicked out to wet his lips like he was buying himself a second to think, told me everything I needed to know. The silence stretched between us, thick and charged, and I knew this was the moment where one of us had to make the next move, the moment where we either ended this before it went too far or let it happen completely. And maybe I should have been the one to walk away, maybe I should have stepped out of the car and left this as something that lived in the quiet, something that existed only in the weight of our silence, in the pressure of unspoken words, in the heat of stolen glances. But the problem was, I didn't want to walk away. And neither did he. His hand moved first, slow and deliberate, his fingers brushing against the back of his neck before dropping to rest against his thigh, his grip just barely tightening, just enough to tell me that he was holding himself back, just enough to tell me that he was still waiting, still watching, still leaving room for me to pull away, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned forward again, the space between us smaller than before, the warmth of the car making the air feel thick, suffocating, electric with something that was no longer just tension but something fully real, fully acknowledged, fully unavoidable. And when I reached forward, when my hand skimmed against his arm, when I felt the way his body went completely still beneath my touch, the moment became something else entirely. "You're playing a dangerous game," he murmured, his voice lower, rougher, his eyes flicking toward me through the mirror, dark and unreadable, but his body told me everything his voice didn't, the way his muscles tensed beneath my fingertips, the way his breathing slowed, the way his grip flexed once against his thigh before stilling again, like he was waiting to see just how far I was willing to take this. "So are you," I murmured, my voice barely above a breath, and when his lips parted slightly, when his fingers twitched like he was about to reach for something, for me, maybe, for the last bit of restraint he still had left, maybe, I knew, there was no more pretending anymore. The air between us was so thick I could taste it, the heat of his body so close to mine that I could feel the weight of the next decision hanging there, pressing down on both of us, and for a split second, I thought maybe he would stop, maybe he would shake his head, maybe he would pull away and remind me that this wasn't something we could afford to do, but then, he moved. Not away. Not back. But forward. And when his fingers found my wrist again, when his touch wasn't hesitant anymore, wasn't uncertain anymore, wasn't something either of us could mistake for anything but what it was, I let go. Of restraint. Of logic. Of every last excuse I had left. And when he turned toward me, when the heat of his breath brushed against my jaw, when his grip tightened, when I finally let my hand slide fully over his, when I stopped thinking and just let it happen, I knew. This wasn't just about desire anymore. This was about something we weren't ready to name yet. And as the city blurred outside, as the moment unraveled into something we could never take back, I realized I didn't care what it was called, as long as it was real. The night outside the car was alive with the hum of the city, the distant pulse of headlights flickering against rain-slicked streets, the faint sound of laughter and muffled conversations from people who had no idea that inside this car, inside this small, enclosed space that had become something neither of us could escape from, something had unraveled, something had snapped, something had shifted beyond the point of return. And as I sat there, my breath still uneven, my pulse still hammering, my skin still burning from the last touch, the last moment, the last decision that had already changed everything, I knew there was no more pretending, no more backtracking, no more stepping away from whatever this was. Ethan's grip on the wheel was too tight, his jaw locked, his breathing slow and measured like he was forcing himself to stay composed, forcing himself to keep his hand steady, forcing himself to act like this wasn't the moment where everything between us had fully, completely, undeniably shifted. But when I exhaled, when I let my fingers skim against my knee, still hyper-aware of the fact that minutes ago they had been somewhere else entirely, when I let my gaze drift toward the mirror, catching the way his pupils were still blown wide, the way his lips were still slightly parted, the way his entire body was coiled with something he wasn't bothering to hide anymore, I knew he felt it too. He didn't speak right away. Didn't move. Didn't do anything except grip the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him tethered, like if he let go, if he so much as shifted, if he turned and met my gaze fully, if he allowed himself to acknowledge what had just happened, he wouldn't be able to stop himself. And then, slowly, too slowly, like he was making sure I had time to stop him, like he was making sure I had time to pull away, like he was giving me every possible chance to deny what we both knew was already inevitable, he turned his head. His gaze met mine. Held. Didn't waver. Didn't retreat. Didn't second guess. The muscle in his jaw twitched, his fingers flexing just slightly against the leather, and then, before I could say anything, before I could think, before I could decide whether I wanted to keep sitting in the thick, unbearable weight of whatever this was, he spoke. "You ever gonna let me drive you somewhere that isn't just home?" His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something controlled, something that made my stomach tighten, something that sent a slow, heated pulse down my spine, something that told me he wasn't just asking a simple question, something that told me he was waiting for my answer, waiting to see if I would give him one, waiting to see if I would keep playing this game or if I would finally admit that it wasn't a game anymore. I swallowed, my throat dry, my heartbeat a dull, steady thud against my ribs, and when I dragged my hand through my hair, when I exhaled, when I let myself actually look at him, when I let myself see what was in his gaze, the quiet amusement, the undeniable certainty, the complete lack of hesitation, I realized he had made his choice. He was just waiting for me to make mine. "Depends," I murmured, keeping my voice steady even though nothing about me was steady right now, even though I was still trying to ground myself, still trying to convince myself that I had any control left when I knew that I had already given it up the moment I let him touch me, the moment I leaned in first, the moment I stopped pretending I didn't want him. "On what?" he asked, his head tilting just slightly, his fingers tapping once, slow and deliberate, against the wheel, and when I exhaled, when I let the words settle between us for just a second longer than necessary, when I let the silence stretch, I saw it again, the patience, the challenge, the quiet invitation that I had been ignoring for too long. "On whether you're asking because you want to drive," I said, my voice quieter now, heavier, more certain than it had ever been, "or because you want me to go somewhere with you." And just like that, the tension snapped all over again. He let out a slow breath, his head dropping just barely, his fingers tightening around the wheel, and for a second, a long, unbearable second, I thought maybe he would say something else, maybe he would push just a little more, maybe he would make it easier for me to step into this completely, but then, when he lifted his gaze back to mine, when he exhaled through his nose, when his mouth curved into that slow, knowing smirk, when he let the moment hang there, thick and charged and impossible to ignore, I realized he wasn't going to push me. I had to be the one to step forward this time. So I did. I reached forward, my fingers brushing over the sleeve of his jacket, slow, deliberate, my touch just barely there, a test, an answer, a decision, and when he inhaled sharply, when his muscles tensed beneath my fingertips, when he didn't pull away, when he finally, turned his entire body toward me, I knew I was exactly where I wanted to be. "You should probably start the car," I murmured, my voice quieter now, just barely above a breath, and when his lips parted slightly, when his smirk widened into something deeper, something certain, something that felt like a promise, he exhaled, his fingers moving toward the ignition, his grip still tight, still steady, still completely in control, but this time, when his knuckles brushed against my knee as he shifted gears, when his touch lingered just a second longer than it should have, when his breath hitched just slightly before he rolled his shoulders back, before he let himself relax into what was already happening between us, before he gave me that one last chance to back out that I wasn't going to take, I realized. This wasn't just about a ride anymore. This wasn't just about what happened in the backseat of this car. This wasn't just about what we had been pretending wasn't real for months. This was something else entirely now. And when the car pulled away from the curb, when the city lights blurred into gold and silver, when the world outside kept moving but everything inside this car felt like it had finally settled into place, I leaned back, my gaze flicking toward him, the curve of his mouth, the steady confidence in his grip, the weight of the night still humming between us, and I realized I wasn't going home. And neither was he.